Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a six-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Hello everybody and welcome back to Misquoting Jesus. We've spoken about forgeries in early Christian writings before, and today we're revisiting the subject. But don't worry, we're not going to cover old ground. In previous episodes, we've talked about why an ancient author might want to forge a document, how we know if it is a forgery, and how a forger might try and avoid detection. This week, we're focusing solely on the New Testament, exactly how much of it is made up of forged writings. Does the New Testament change at all if we remove that forged material? And what can these forgeries tell us about early Christian debates and disputes? Before we get into that, though, Bart, hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. We're, as you know, we're recording this right, just pretty new into the new year, and I'm still in London, and I'm, now that semester's over and classes since classes are over and Christmas is over, I'm able to get back to my routine, which is right now, first thing in the morning when I get up, I read some Greek, ancient Greek, and I've been reading Plato's. Euthyphro, and we ought to do a session on this kind of thing. It's a really interesting thing where Plato, I'm not sure you want to hear this, but you're going to, where Plato tries to show in this thing where Socrates is in this dialogue with somebody, and as always, he's showing that the person doesn't know what he's talking about, but he deals with a number of issues that are really relevant for Christians. He's a pagan. I mean, in this dialogue, this person, Euthyphro, thinks he knows what it means to be pious, to be righteous before the gods, and he says it's by doing the things that the gods love. And Socrates says, well, do the gods is something good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's good? That's a big difference. And
it's quite a question.
It's a really good question, and the whole dialogue is trying to show that, deal with that kind of issue. But the point is, you have Christians who say that, it's right because God says so. But then, well, does God say so because it's right? Or if God says anything, is it right? And some people would say, yeah, anything he says would be right. And other people say, well, no, of course. I mean, he likes what's right. And so anyway, so my, I really enjoy reading the ancient Greek. I've loved Plato for decades and decades, but it's nice to get back into this routine. And, it's not the way most people get up and have their first cup of coffee. So how are you doing? Do you read a Sumerian when you get up?
Well, I was going to say, you and Josh, the more I get to know you, the more you two have in common, because when he gets up, he gets his coffee, he drives into work, he goes in very early. He usually leaves the house around 5. And when he gets in, he spends half an hour drinking his coffee and reading Akkadian.
Okay, that's worse.
Wow. So he's actually dubbed this the year of Akkadian. So he's getting back into Akkadian and that kind of thing. So I typically do not start my morning with Akkadian. I usually start it with a cup of tea and a very quick shower before all of the children kind of descend.
Yeah, well, that's it. If you can get in any time before the kids get up, as a parent, man, I know that's how I started getting up early, is just because, man, I needed some time.
Yeah, I did when they were very, very small. I would sleep as late as I could, which isn't terribly late when you have small babies. Yeah. But now they're reliably sleeping in until 7. I need that hour and a half just to wake up and be a grown up and have just 20 minutes to myself before someone needs me to change a diaper or make breakfast or something similar.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good routine. Okay. Right.
So how is London? How has the rest of your break been?
Well, it's wet and dreary, and for some reason, Londoners think it's a good idea for the sun to be out for only 8 hours a day at this time of year. But it's so hard to complain about London. I mean, London, of course, London's just quite amazing. I've gone to the theater a few times, and seeing family and stuff. So yeah, it's all great. Yeah.
My mother lives on the Isle of Skye, and they don't quite get 8 hours a day at the moment. It's
Yeah,
It's
that's way up
getting
there.
dark. Yeah, it's dark very early, and it's the weather they have around this time of year is very it's Scottish, bleak,
Yeah,
dreary,
yeah,
lots and lots
yeah,
of rain. So even when the sun is up, it's not always visible. So
yeah.
she has a lot of darkness at the moment.
Yes. Okay. I know, and that can affect people. I mean, it really can. So,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Right.
We should get into forgery though. And for those who missed our last conversation, which was I think a year or so ago, could you just tell us why forgery in the New Testament is an important topic?
Yeah, so I guess we should. I think we'll probably want to be defining terms in a minute, but just so people understand at the outset, when we're talking about forgery, we're not talking about somebody who's like making up stories or fabricating events or ideas or something. We're talking about it's a claim about an author. Did an did the person who an author writes something and claims to be somebody, if they actually are not that somebody, if they claim to be somebody famous and they're not that person, that's what we're calling a forgery. So it has to do with who the author is. And the reason it matters for the New Testament is because there are lots of books in the New Testament that go under an author's name that the author almost certainly didn't write. Uh, and there are a lot of debated cases too, but there are some that are apart from strong evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics and conservative theologians would say, no, they all were written by the people who claim to be the authors, but historical scholars haven't thought that for a long time.
So you mentioned we should absolutely define terms so everyone knows what we're talking about when we use specific words. You've covered forgery. We've got also I always get that wrong. Pseudepigraphy and orthonymy. Could you just explain what those two are, please?
Yeah, right. So I'll start with orthonymy because it's one of my favorite words that nobody knows. A book is orthonymous. If it's, I mean, we have orthodontics, right? And orthodontics is when they set your teeth straight. So orthos means straight or right, and orthonymous writing is one where the person who claims to be writing it is the person who wrote it. And so, like, if I sign my book Bart Ehrman, that's by me. If I sign one of my books Stephen King, that's a forgery. Scholars for a very long time, especially New Testament scholars, have been reluctant to call books in the New Testament or even other books forgeries because it's such a loaded term in modern parlance. And so most New Testament scholars call that phenomenon pseudepigraphy. What most people would call forgery, they call pseudepigraphy. Pseudo, they do that for a couple reasons. One is it doesn't sound offensive. Another is that nobody knows what it means. And so that's why it doesn't sound offensive. But if people were actually told what it means, they probably would be offended. Pseudepigraphy means it's a book that's inscribed with a lie, meaning the author's claiming to be somebody that he's not. So our word for that is forgery, but scholars prefer to call them pseudepigrapha because, for the reasons I mentioned, so that it's synonymous on they're pseudonyms on I'm sorry, they're synonyms. Yeah, let's define these terms. They are synonyms on certain levels, but it's possible for books to be circulated under the name of somebody who did not write them without the author making that claim. And if the author makes the claim, then it's a forgery. If you have a book that, like, the author's not claiming to be somebody, like he writes anonymously, and then somebody else says, "Oh yeah, that gospel was written by Matthew," then and the author doesn't claim so. Then if it's wrong, then it's not the author's fault. So you wouldn't call that a forgery. You would call that a false attribution.
And all four of the canonical gospels are pseudepigraphic, I believe.
Well, they're pseudepigraphic by that understanding that they're pseudepigraphic because they have a name over them that is not probably the name of the person who wrote them, according to most historical scholarship. And we've talked about that before on here about the four gospels, and I've got a course on it on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we advertise sometimes here on the blog, where I try to explain why they probably were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But since the authors don't claim to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're not forgeries in the sense I'm using it. I would say you could call them pseudepigrapha, but only because they circulate under a false name, which is what pseudepigraphy means, lying name or false name. But it's not the author's fault. It's just somebody later said they were written by these people.
Thank you. Now, in your book, Forgery and Counter-Forgery, you write that only 8 of the 27 books of the New Testament are orthonymous. So they were written by the person who claims to have written them. What are those books?
Yeah, so it's a little bit shocking when you add it up. For a number of years, I talked about pseudepigraphy in the New Testament and never bothered to add it up. When you do, you say, "Wait a second, there are 27 books in the New Testament. How many of them do we know? Written by the person who claims to be the author?" Well, there are in the New Testament there are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul, and scholars are pretty sure that 7 of them actually were written by Paul. So much so, this is so widespread among scholarship that very commonly scholars will just talk about the undisputed Pauline letters. And what they mean by that is it's undisputed who wrote them. It's a little bit of a stretch, of course, because scholars debate everything, and so nothing is undisputed technically. But basically, everybody agrees that Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, First Thessalonians, and Philemon were written by Paul, and the others either possibly not, or probably not, or almost certainly not. So you got those 7. The other book, interestingly, is the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, which claims to be written by somebody named John. And almost everybody thinks, yeah, somebody named John wrote it. It's wrong to say probably that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote it, that the disciple of Jesus wrote it, but it doesn't claim to be written by John, the son of Zebedee. It's just some guy named John, and it was a very common name. So that's usually counted as an orthonymous work as well.
So that leaves 19 books that are either forged or falsely attributed. Why is so much of the New Testament in that category?
Yeah, good question. So the actual forgeries, the things I would call forgeries, where people say they're somebody when they're not. When you have authors claiming to be Paul, writing Ephesians and Colossians and Second Thessalonians, when they almost certainly were not Paul. And by the way, there are reasons for this. This isn't just kind of crazy stuff that scholars throw out there. They're actually very, very detailed studies of all these. And if anybody wants to see a really detailed study, my book that you mentioned earlier, Forgery and Counter-Forgery, goes through each one of these individually and shows why it looks like it wasn't written by that person. So those people who are claiming to be Paul, or the people claiming to be Peter, or the person claiming to be James, or these ones that claim somebody who probably did not write them, almost certainly are doing this because they think they've got an important message to convey, and they're somebody that nobody's ever heard of, and so nobody will read their book, but it's an important message, and so they claim to be somebody famous, so that their book will be read. And in all these cases, they were terrifically successful, because today billions of people are convinced. And so it's a very effective ploy. Whereas people who wrote books in their own names that nobody ever heard of, they didn't get copied or read. So that's why you probably have so many forgeries. And as we said in our other episode, this was a common practice in the ancient world. It's not like this is unusual in the New Testament. This is a common practice.
So what about the books that have been or falsely attributed to a specific author? Why does that happen?
Well, it happens for a similar reason. Suppose you've got a bunch of gospels in the 2nd century, which you do have. There were a number of gospels floating around about Jesus' life, and there were some of them that church fathers didn't like, church leaders thought were heretical, or just not very good, or whatever. But there were others that they said these are really authoritative, and they're the ones that we should use for understanding who Jesus was. But they're anonymous, and if you have an authority for Jesus, you want the authority to be an author who knew what he was talking about. And so they get attributed to 2 of the disciples, Matthew and John, and to 2 of the companions of apostles, Peter, the companion of Peter, and Luke, the companion of Paul. And so false attributions are almost always to increase the authority of the writing so that it'll be read and considered authoritative.
So if we take the New Testament and we remove all of the books that academics have determined are forgeries or misattributions, what does that do? How does that change the message of the New Testament?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you take out the false attributions, if you just get rid of them, the thing is, you wouldn't get rid of the false attributions. You would still say, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If somebody convinces you, this Matthew really was not written by the tax collector who is a follower of Jesus, and suppose you become convinced of that, you wouldn't get rid of it. You would just say, okay, well, it's called something wrong. But if somebody says, this book of Ephesians is somebody who's saying that he's Paul, but he's not, he's lying about it, then you might say, man, I don't know if I want lies in the New Testament, and you might get rid of it. If you got rid of Ephesians, it would change things. And for all of these books, I'll just pick two of Paul's books, Ephesians and Second Thessalonians. For Ephesians, Ephesians is a book that emphasizes that people have already experienced a kind of heavenly existence here on earth because they've accepted Christ, and that they're already living a heavenly existence, and so that you have and to some extent you have the rewards of heaven now already. That's the opposite of what Paul himself thought, but it's a view that's widely held among people today, that we're already enjoying God's grace, and so it's manifest to us in these wonderful ways today because of how glorious my life is now, and that can find support in Ephesians, but it won't find support in Paul, who believes that this age is an age of suffering for those who are on God's side. With Second Thessalonians, that's an interesting one because in a concrete way, Second Thessalonians is the one book of the New Testament that says that before Jesus comes back, the Antichrist figure has to go into the temple of God and declare that he is God. And that'll happen before the end. This is the verse that fundamentalists use to say that the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. And so this has fueled the interests of fundamentalist Christians in Israel taking over the Temple Mount and destroying the Dome of the Rock and building the temple again so that Jesus can come back. That would be serious. But it's all based on this verse in Second Thessalonians that claims to be written by Paul, but is not.
Would the removal of the books have an impact on more moral debates that we see among Christians today?
Among moral debates, it's interesting because some of these books are fairly emphatic about issues about like how slaves ought to obey their masters. Rather than masters, you should free your slaves. And so some of these books, like, if you have been used to justify slavery. One book that I think in particular has been problematic for the modern situation among Christians and probably Western culture more broadly, more until recently, is First Timothy. In First Timothy chapter 2, there's this rather infamous passage that where the author, claiming to be Paul, even though he's almost certainly not, tells women that they are to be quiet and not to exercise any authority over a man. And that men are to rule the roost, not just in church and not just at home, but like everywhere, because especially in a married relationship, because Adam was created first. Eve was just kind of an afterthought, and she was created to help the man. She's not created to rule the man. And she's the reason that so many problems are in the world now, because she's the one who got tempted and ate the fruit and then gave her husband to eat. And so this is what happens when you let women exercise authority over men. They get deceived by the devil and they lead them into sin. And so you can't have that. So women have to be subject to men. So that's not good, but it's in one of these books that is not really written by Paul, that claims to be by Paul. And it's one of the main reasons that people today still widely call Paul a misogynist, because of a book that he didn't write. So so it matters for that too.
Paul's had his name tarnished a little bit by some of these forgeries, I feel.
Yeah, by lots of things, mainly by accusations that he was misogynist and anti-Semitic, and he's not either, actually.
Now, before we finish, I wanted to get into a little bit about how these books can be used to better understand early debates and disputes among Christians. We have another term to define before we get to that, though. What are counter-forgeries?
Counter-forgeries. So that's a term that I use. I don't know of anybody else who's ever used it in English. there's a German scholar who wrote a major book on forgery in the ancient world named his last name is Speyer, Walter Speyer, who wrote a book that gives this term Gegenfälschung, which is means counter forgery, and he doesn't quite mean by it what I do. I kind of came up with this idea, and the reason I came up with it actually was because of my reading of Second Thessalonians. And so let me explain the situation. Second Thessalonians is really interesting for a lot of reasons. It's one of these books people don't read much and they don't pay much attention to it, but it's really pretty interesting. There are very good reasons for thinking Paul did not write it. One reason being that it clearly is dependent on First Thessalonians. It has like verses that are virtually the same between First and Second Thessalonians, and you think, okay, that shows Paul wrote it, right? Well, not exactly, because in Paul's writings, we never have verses repeated between books. But beyond that, when the book does say something that Paul doesn't talk about in First Thessalonians, when it deals with the topic but doesn't use his words, it presents the opposite point of view, especially about this question of is Jesus coming back soon or not? And in First Thessalonians, you can find this in all 5 of the chapters of First Thessalonians, is you need to be ready. Jesus is coming back anytime now. You don't want to be caught unawares. You've got to be watchful because he's going to come like a thief in the night, when you're not expecting it, and whammo. So it's going to happen in an unexpected way. So that he says that throughout First Thessalonians, especially chapters 4 and 5. When you get to Second Thessalonians, allegedly Paul, sometimes using the same verses, says, don't be deceived by a letter as if from us, that the end is going to be coming soon. Because first, these things have to take place. And then he gives this list of things that have to take place, including this Antichrist figure going into the temple. And so it's saying the opposite of what First Thessalonians says. So it doesn't look like Paul wrote this. Why do you have these verses? Because that are the same, because the author who's writing it wants you to think it's Paul, and what sounds more like Paul than Paul's writings. And so you quote Paul. So that's a very interesting book. But the thing about counter-forgery is, in 2 Thessalonians 2:2, this author says that they're not supposed to be deceived by a letter as if from us. In other words, he's saying, don't be fooled by a forgery out there claiming this, because now I'm going to tell you the truth. But if 2 Thessalonians is a forgery, then it's countering another forgery. And so what I call counter-forgery is I've found a bunch of these things that are they're forgeries that are countering the views of other forgeries. And I thought, man, that is cool. And I started finding a bunch of these. So my book, Forgery and Counter-Forgery, which is it's a scholarly book, but it deals with these counter-forgeries throughout early Christianity.
Are there other forgeries that can give some insight into what early Christians were arguing about amongst themselves?
Yeah, well, here's another counter-forgery in the New Testament, the book of James. So James, whoever wrote James does not come out and claim that he is the brother of Jesus, but he's always been taken to be the brother of Jesus. And when I analyze this in my book, I show that he wants you to think that he's the brother of Jesus. That there are pretty clear indications in the book itself, if you analyze it closely, that he's the brother of Jesus. One is, I'll just give, in case people are wondering, he writes to people throughout the world, to the 12 tribes of Israel, which is just a way of saying the people of God. And so he's writing this to be a letter that circulates around the world. And he says and he claims to be somebody named James. Well, James is a very common name. If you in the ancient world, if you want people to know who you are and you're writing to people who don't even know you, you normally explain who you are. And so like people would explain, I'm this person, I'm James, this person, or I'm James, the son of Joseph, or something like that. But if he just leaves it out there, he's James, then they're almost certainly thinking, oh yeah, it's got to be that James, because who else wouldn't identify himself? So it's that James. Oh, okay. So I think he is clearly trying to claim to be James, the brother of Jesus. But it's a counter-forgery because this gets a little down in the weeds. I won't get very far down, but I mentioned Ephesians earlier. And one of the things that Ephesians argues, the book of Ephesians argues, is that a person is made right with God, not by doing good works, but by faith, only by faith. And that sounds like Paul. And people say, yeah, that's what Paul says, right? And when you actually analyze Ephesians, it's not what Paul says. When Paul says a person is justified by faith and not by works, he says not by works of the law, by which he means you're not made right with God by keeping the Jewish law. Ephesians isn't talking about the Jewish law. Ephesians is talking about being a good person and doing good things for people. You can't be saved that way. And he's almost always taken as opposing Paul because there are clear passages in James where he's taken something that he thinks Paul wrote and attacking it. And so he's attacking something that Paul actually didn't say, because what he's saying is that you're not justified, you're justified not by doing good deeds, and Paul's talking about doing the Jewish law. But Ephesians does talk about not being saved by doing good deeds. And so it looks like James is attacking something like Ephesians, or maybe Ephesians itself, which is a forgery, and James is a forgery, so James is a counter-forgery. You get all that? It's kind of complicated.
Does the inclusion of some specific forgeries in the New Testament by the church fathers give insight as well into the kind of religion that early Christians were trying to form, as opposed to what we now would consider to be heretical beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the pseudepigraphy in the New Testament, a lot of the books that I would call forgeries or falsely attributed books, are attacking various other forms of Christianity. And it's very interesting to see this work out. In some ways, that broad idea that the New Testament authors are attacking other forms of Christianity is in some ways that idea goes all the way back into Christian scholarship. But what scholars have realized over the last 100 or 150 years is that authors of the New Testament themselves are at odds on major issues and are arguing points that are different from the issues that others argue. Just to give you one example, I've mentioned both Matthew and Paul. Paul insists that followers of Jesus do not have to follow the law. And so if somebody's a Gentile, they don't have to convert to Judaism, they don't have to get circumcised, they don't have to keep kosher, they don't have to observe the Sabbath, they don't have to keep the Jewish law. Read Matthew sometime and see what that says. Matthew says you have to keep the law better than the scribes and the Pharisees. Your righteousness has to be more than theirs, or you won't get into the kingdom of heaven. Not one letter, not one part of a letter will pass away before all the law is accomplished, and you have to keep it all. Later in Matthew, the author says that you are to do everything the Pharisees tell you to do. This is chapter 23, verse 2. So the Pharisees have, kind of these strict interpretations of the Torah, the law. You have to do those, Jesus says. The problem with the Pharisees is that they don't do what they say they should do. But what they say to do is right. Would Paul say that? I don't think so. And so I think just about all of these books have some kind of issue that they're really finding important precisely because other Christians disagree with them on it.
If they're finding these issues to be important, why include other books that directly contradict them?
Right. This is a really good question, and I get asked this a lot. Look, if they're at, if Matthew and Paul don't agree, why'd they include both of them? Well, okay, good. Well, first of all, who's the they? The they are the people in the ancient world who thought that they were both important books. Today, there are 2 billion people, at least, who think they are important books. How many of those 2 billion have read Matthew and read Paul and thought that they're at odds with each other? Like precisely almost, 0.01%. Just a few scholars who pay attention to these things. People just don't notice this kind of thing. If you've got books that people tell you are authoritative, then you simply assume that they're basically on the same page. And that's especially the case when you put them between two covers, because then it's one book, not 27 books. And so you just assume if everything's between two covers that it's all the same. And in the ancient world, they didn't have the two covers, but they had collections of books. And if you have a collection of the Gospels and a collection of Paul, you just assume they're the same. But the other thing that happens is that when church fathers decide which books are going to be in the New Testament, even when they realized that they're different from each other, they also realized that if you put them together and think about them as one book by one author, they're all written by God, they're not written by different authors. If you think that, then it takes the edges off of each one, because you have to read Matthew in light of Paul and Paul in light of Matthew. When Matthew was writing, he wasn't planning on you comparing him to Paul and doing that. He's planning on you reading Matthew. When Paul was writing before Matthew, he wasn't planning on you comparing his writings to somebody else later. But once you put them in the same canon, then you more or less are forced to interpret them in light of each other, and it rubs off most of their differences.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion. We're going to take a very quick break and then we'll be back with Bart's weekly update. Imagine this: Jesus, the founder of Christianity, and the Apostle Paul, its greatest missionary, teaching and shaping the Christian faith with opposing perspectives. While Jesus emphasized repentance in preparation for the coming kingdom, Paul focused on believing in Jesus' death and resurrection. So, were they on the same page? Delve into the complexities of this debate in Bart Ehrman's online course, Paul and Jesus, The Great Divide. In this 8-lecture course, you'll discover why Paul rarely mentioned Jesus' words and deeds, and uncover the intricacies of their views on salvation, the Jewish law, and ethical behavior. Bart will also explore the following burning question: was Paul a true follower of Jesus' teachings? Or is it right to say that Paul transformed the Jewish religion of Jesus to the Christian religion about Jesus? Don't miss this opportunity to explore the profound influence of Paul and Jesus on the Christian faith. Visit bartehrman.com/Paul to learn more or enroll today. And remember, use the discount code MJPodcast for a special discount.
This is Bart's Weekly Update, where we get to catch up on all the latest about Dr. Ehrman's book releases, speaking engagements, ehrmanblog.org happenings, and online course launches.
Bart, you have a new course coming up. What's the topic?
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I've talked about Matthew several times, as it turns out, just by serendipity in our discussion. And this is going to be a course on the Gospel of Matthew. It's going to be an 8-lecture course, lectures of 40, 50 minutes, something like that. 8 lectures over 2 days, just on the Gospel of Matthew. I'm calling it The Genius of Matthew, What Scholars Say About Our First Gospel. First, in this sense, doesn't mean first chronologically, because it probably wasn't our first to be written, but it is the first in the New Testament, and it is one of the favorite gospels in throughout periods of history. It's been the favorite gospel in the New Testament because it has so much material in it that's found only there. For example, the Sermon on the Mount, only in Matthew. The Lord's Prayer, the form that people recite in the New Testament, only in Matthew. The Beatitudes, a bunch of the parables, bunch of episodes that people know about. The visit of the wise men to Jesus, only in Matthew. And so you get all this material in Matthew, and it's very easy to misread Matthew, and most people don't pay close attention to what he's actually saying. In part for the reason I mentioned earlier, that when you put all these books into one canon, you read them all in light of each other. But if you read Matthew just on its own terms, and just you want to see what this author has to say, it can be quite startling sometimes what he's saying. And so there's a lot of stuff in here that I think is misunderstood because they don't understand the historical context. And a lot of it is misunderstood because they're assuming that Matthew's saying the same thing that, say, John is. But I'll be trying to show that that's not the case. So anyway, this will be 8 lectures, and I'm excited about this one because Matthew is really a great gospel, and it's very, very interesting in lots of ways people wouldn't expect.
Could you give us an example of one of the things that people often misunderstand from Matthew?
Well, one thing is what I was saying earlier is that the people just assume that Matthew thinks that, of course, you don't have to keep the Jewish law. He can't be saying that. But when you start looking at what he says, when he talks about the Jewish law, he never gets rid of it. He says you have to do it, and have to do it even more. And so when if the Jewish law says don't murder, Jesus said, but I say to you, don't get angry with somebody else. And so Jesus is not getting rid of the law. He's not saying the law says don't murder, but I say, go ahead and murder. No, it's not that. He intensifies it. He intensifies it so much, you're not even supposed to get angry at somebody. And so then the natural response is, well, he can't mean that, right? Yeah, okay, we're going to see whether he means it or not. And if he does mean it, how can he possibly mean it that you can't get angry? Well, he's intensifying the law. He's not getting rid of it. And so the way Christians have typically gotten around that is by saying, what Jesus is doing, he's showing that the law is impossible to keep, so that if it's impossible to keep, you need Jesus, because otherwise you're damned. And so that's I can see why people would say that, but it's not what Matthew says. Matthew does not assume it's impossible. Matthew, as we'll see, it's going to take me a while to develop that. So saying it in 2 minutes probably doesn't like convince anybody. But if you come to the course, I'm going to be dealing with this kind of thing, trying to understand Matthew on its own terms, instead of putting theological views on him that he didn't have, or trying to assume that he means something that some other author of the New Testament means.
And with an 8-lecture course, I suspect you'll have an awful lot more time to actually fully develop that thought.
Yeah.
So that is The Genius of Matthew, What Scholars Say About the First Gospel, for those who are interested. The live recordings will be taking place on the 3rd and 4th of February. Those are, again, 8 lectures. The full price is $59.95. That includes attendance of the live lectures, question and answer participation, and then lifetime access to the course after they've been recorded. There is, however, an early bird pricing of $49.95. That's available until January 28th. And on top of that, you can use the MJ podcast code for an additional discount. So if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend booking that or purchasing that before January 28th and use your code to get the best price possible. We are going to have a brief break, and then Bart's going to be on his soapbox.
Take cover, fundamentalist Christians and mythicists. It's time for Bart Gets on His Soapbox, the segment where Bart exposes the belief systems and social constructs that frustrate him most.
Okay, Bart, what are you on your soapbox about this week?
I think, on a number of occasions, I've talked about how I get a lot of flack from, especially from evangelicals and fundamentalists. And I understand that because the kinds of things that I say are contrary to what many of them believe, and I get that. I'm also, they'll get a lot of flack from people on the other side. And I get a lot of people who comment either on my blog or in personal emails about how they can't understand why I don't really just go out and try and trash Christianity, because in their view, it's just complete nonsense. I understand why people might think that any particular religion is nonsense in the technical sense, that it doesn't make sense to them. It is nonsense, but usually they mean it's something more derogatory than that. And why don't you just attack it, and just go after it and just say, and just come out and say what nonsense it is? And the thing is, the reason I find that difficult is because I think all of us are fundamentally wrong about lots of things. And that in, 100 years, probably many of the things that we just take for granted as being right will be thought of as being nonsense. Moreover, I know, so, the fact that, calling Christianity is nonsense is like, well, what's the point of that? I mean, you could call it just about anything nonsense because you don't think it makes sense to you. But then people say, yeah, but it just literally, logically doesn't make any sense. And the reason I don't like that is because I know people who are way smarter than you and me and the people asking this question who are believing Christians. I know scientists. I know literary scholars. I know historians. Pick your kind of person who are really brilliant, who subscribe to the Christian message. And so I just think that that it doesn't really help things to call something you disagree with nonsense. It's a non-starter. What I prefer to do is to try and talk to people, try and get them to think about what they're thinking and saying. The one kind of Christianity that I really am opposed to is the kind of hardcore fundamentalism that that does harm to people. Because of its stances on, especially on social issues and political issues, where I think they can do a lot of harm and have done a lot of harm and do a lot of harm. Plus, they mislead people so they don't have to think. With fundamentalist Christianity, often it's just a matter of accepting some authority's word for it rather than thinking through the issues critically and carefully yourself. So I am against that. I don't think I would call it nonsense, though, because it makes a lot of sense when you're in that closed system, as I was for a long time. Fundamentalism makes sense within its own reality. It's not internally incoherent any more than any other system is. And so I wouldn't call it nonsense in that way. You grant the assumptions and it makes a lot of sense. So anyway, I get a little bit upset with people who have a completely dismissive view of people they disagree with religiously. And I know a lot of people think that's weird because people think that I'm dismissive of people who are religious, but I don't see it that way myself. I find myself, I when I have Christian students, I just try and get them to be smart about their Christian faith. I don't try to have them get rid of it. And I don't call it nonsense. It's a different sense from the one that I have. And I think my sense is better, of course. Otherwise I'd have other sense. but I just don't think it's that useful to be belittling people for what they believe, rather than trying to engage with them and trying to understand what they think and trying to help them, think something else, or maybe you yourself should start thinking something else. So I had a friend in graduate school who used to say, I believe in the right to convert people, and I believe in the right to be converted. And I think, well, okay, that's pretty good. That's kind of how I think.
I like that. If you're going to go out and evangelize, then you also need to be prepared to be evangelized too, and maybe change your mind at some point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, before we finish for the week, would you mind just summarizing what we spoke about today?
Well, we were talking about this kind of startling phenomenon that most of the New Testament is not written by people who are claimed as the authors. In some instances, there are authors who actually claim to be a famous person when they know full well they're not that person. Whoever wrote 2 Peter, it almost certainly wasn't Peter. Whoever wrote 1 Timothy was almost certainly not Paul, claiming to be Paul. And so you have that. And that's what modern people would call forgery. When somebody claims to be a famous person, they're not when they're writing. Other books are attributed to people who probably did not write them, or almost certainly didn't write them. So, the four Gospels, for example, the book of Acts, they're claimed for somebody that the person himself doesn't make the claim. So that's a startling phenomenon. And we were talking about why that's significant. I mean, partly because there are, a lot of books in the New Testament that are like that, and partly because some of the things set out in these books have become very important within Christian circles historically and still today, and it's worth knowing who actually said these things.
But thank you so much. Audience, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please subscribe to the podcast and make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com. And if you are interested in his Gospel of Matthew courses, you can access that at www.bartehrman.com/Matthew. And again, you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on that also. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. But what are we talking about next time?
Yeah, actually, it relates to my soapbox just now. We're gonna be talking about my experience within fundamentalism, but I'm going to be talking about some of the positive sides of that. How being a fundamentalist actually, in some ways, weirdly, I guess, in people's views, made a big difference for who I am now and for my life.
Thank you, everybody, and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.